Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for today's edition of Defense One Outlook 2021, our annual policy summit where we look ahead to the future. I want to help introduce our panel today with some opening remarks, some housekeeping before we get into things. First of all, I'm Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One, and it's my pleasure to welcome you back. Today's panel is After Trump and Awaiting Biden, What Now for Conservatives and National Security? And before we get started, these are the rules and the what's happening. This is how to get this done. So it's a virtual event. You're looking online. On the top right of your screen, you should see a Q&A tab. That's where you can ask your questions to our panelists, and we'll be fielding them at the end of the panel. But I encourage you to submit your questions at any time. Our moderators will pop them up on a screen for me to see, and if it's a really poignant moment at any time, I may offer it to the panelists as well. There's also a chat box where you can post your comments, keep it nice and clean, and you can make any notes if you have any technical issues. Our staff will see those and can help address as well if you need any assistance. This event is being recorded and will be available on demand shortly for you to share with your colleagues if you're watching on our site or if you're watching on our YouTube channel. And without further ado, I would like to welcome our panelists, Richard Fontaine, Chief Executive Officer of CNAS, and Kori Schake, Director of Foreign and Defense Policy Studies at AEI. Oh man, we are in the deep state today, in the Beltway with all these acronyms. We'll get started. So, Richard, Kori, my friends, welcome. It's very good to see you.
Thanks for having us.
It's a joy to be with you, Kevin.
So here we are, mid-December. We just this morning have heard from two very important figures who have confirmed that Joe Biden is in fact the president-elect, Vladimir Putin and Mitch McConnell. So we've reached, I think, it has to have some significance so that we can continue to look forward. I thank you for joining the panel and for talking with us. I wanted to have this conversation with at least you two, and not a whole lot of other people for quite some time, but I think this is a good moment for it, which is, what is the future of conservatives and national security? We know what Trump has given us. We had 4 years of that, and Trump was considered a bit of an outsider to the norm. He ran on it. He wore it as a badge of pride that he was not of the establishment, was not a conservative, but somehow became a Republican. Now you've got Joe Biden, which means an even longer term in the wilderness, if that's the right way to put it, for the folks who were viewed as the stalwart, moderate, mainstream establishment, whoever, fill in the blank, leaders of Republican administrations, Republican political leaders, and conservative foreign policy. So maybe we start off with some basics of helping people understand what are the differences of liberal foreign policy, conservative foreign policy, and maybe this new Trump version or whatever may come of it to follow, so that we can kind of figure out where we are. And I want to walk through some issues with you on everything from multilateralism and forever wars. We'll get into all of that. But Richard and I spoke a little bit beforehand. Kori and I haven't had a chance to speak, so I'm going to let Richard kind of key off a little bit of ideas, and Kori can jump in and react afterwards. But Richard, what are your thoughts on where the landscape is now for those three buckets, if that's the right way to put it, of liberals, mainstream conservatives, and then Trump conservatives on their way out, but who still are looking for a home or trying to carve out space?
Yeah, and I guess the first thing to say is it's always been hard to point to, quote, conservative foreign policy and come up with only one set of coherent ideas. I mean, my former boss, John McCain, would have considered himself a conservative in foreign policy and national security. And Rand Paul would probably consider himself a conservative in foreign policy. But I can tell you they didn't agree on a whole lot. They agreed on some things, but not a lot. In the Bush administration, Colin Powell and Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld all probably considered themselves, and Connie Rice, conservatives in foreign policy, but there are a lot of differences. So the first sort of task is, well, what is it that we're actually talking about here? And when people talk about kind of the mainstream Republican internationalist conservative foreign policy, to me, there's kind of a few principles that not everybody would always sign up to, but most conservative internationalists believe most of the time. So, a strong defense underpinned by strong alliances and the forward deployment of American troops, free trade, a generally open international economic system, a belief in American exceptionalism and the necessity of U.S. global leadership, multilateralism when it serves American interests and values, but not necessarily multilateralism just as an end in itself. When possible, a bias in favor of democracy and the promotion of human rights rather than the embrace of autocracy. And if you accept what I just laid out as more or less what most conservative internationalists on the Republican side would believe most of the time, it's pretty striking that Trump is on the other side of most of those things, right? So, he's not a big believer in promoting democracy. He thinks alliances undermine America rather than help and things like that. So the big question is about the sort of give and take is what purchase there's going to be, I think, for sort of Trumpian ideas on the Republican side. It's been striking to me over the past 4 years that not even members of his own administration have the same view of many of these things than the president himself. So to the degree to which there is Trumpism, it's been around one person, but, Trump would say, our allies suck and they're getting rich under our protection and they're terrible. And then, his Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State and Vice President would go out and say, we've never been stronger shoulder to shoulder, together with NATO and all these other things. So, same thing on some of the democracy and human rights issues and things like that. So I think part of this, the answer to your question, you will have this kind of core, I think, set of beliefs that I described on the Republican side. But the big question is, does Trumpism as a political force, as opposed to this sort of philosophy, does that endure? Is there votes to be had there by candidates? And if the answer is yes, then you're going to see, this sort of philosophical attractions of that. But there's just not that many people who have a full-throated embrace of Trumpism the way Donald Trump has had it.
Corey, what are your thoughts on did Richard nail it there?
So I've always loved Walter Russell Mead's book, Special Providence, that outlines different schools of American thought about foreign policy and the world. And two of them I particularly associate with conservatism, right? Which is Jacksonian foreign policy, which is very much what President Trump and his supporters advocate, and the other is Hamiltonian, right? Which is very much conservative internationalism. And those two have always been in competition, along with Jeffersonian and other approaches. And so I don't think the tension is new. I think it's strikingly highlighted because, as Richard said, Donald Trump is a unique kind of political candidate, and he surfed the moment of 2016 so adroitly, right? Like, who had ever thought of a political candidate that was their own best spokesman and engaged directly through a new medium so effectively? So I think Trump crested the moment, but what's really striking is, one other thing, which is President Trump's political genius is in asking first order questions that if people like me were doing our jobs well enough, my mom would know the answer to, right? Why don't allies do more for their own defense? Aren't immigrants taking American jobs? Isn't trade exporting American jobs? And if we Hamiltonians were doing our jobs adequately, the Jacksonians wouldn't have gotten so much purchase in the conversation. But what we see over the 4 years of President Trump's tenure is that public attitudes shifted against the president's answers to those questions. And not just general American public attitudes, Republican attitudes moved against those positions as well. So if you look, for example, at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs polls of American public attitudes every year. They have never been as supportive of allies as an American strength than they are right now. And that's true among Republicans as well as the general population. So I think what President Trump did was, in a very Jacksonian way, ask those first order questions that we Hamiltonians hadn't answered sufficiently well. And then the public, including Republicans, saw policies consistent with a Jacksonian approach, and they actually don't feel great about them. So I do think there is an ebbing tide away from the Jacksonian approach that President Trump has represented, and back towards a more Hamiltonian conservative internationalism among Republicans.
Is that great points? And I want to talk more about the poll in a minute. But to stick with what you're saying, does that mean then the Hamiltonians are much closer in the same bucket with, frankly, the Democrats who are in charge now, which means we would expect, the less challenging of Biden policies and more simpatico and support for this, everyone thinks this return to norms or some regaining of norms of at least when it comes to international affairs, the process, the systems, the respect for it.
I think that's certainly possible. So Mac Thornberry, the outgoing congressman, former chairman of House Armed Services, he represents the most Republican district in the country. 80% of voters in Mac Thornberry's district voted for Donald Trump in 2016. 80% of Mac Thornberry's constituents voted for Donald Trump in 2020. And Mac's theory of the case of why he, who didn't endorse Donald Trump in 2016 or 2020, remains electable in that district is because people think President Trump is giving a voice to genuine concerns they have, right? 73 million Americans voted for him. But also, Mac Thornberry believes that people are exasperated that Washington's not solving their problems. And there, I think, lies the basis for cooperation, both on international issues and on domestic issues. People actually want infrastructure week.
Well, Richard, some of these ideas that you said they're like being for multilateralism, but in a more pragmatic way. Or like Corey is saying, or you both were saying, being actually engaged in the world and wanting, international systems that benefit the United States. Those seem to be common views that are popular right now. But at the same time, we have this forever wars bubble that just keeps popping up, and that has been embraced by the left and the right. And it started on the fringes, and it's made its way to the center, so that I even heard it in Joe Biden's speech this week, introducing Lloyd Austin. And one of the good points he's making of Lloyd Austin was that this general who was in charge of these forever wars and helped, keep them going and advocated for them and lived and breathed in them is going to be the one that get us out of it. That help do it. That he put forth that. So it sounds like Biden is writing this, balance, being that that Trump, maybe not Trump, but the entire Trump world tried to balance as well, of saying, we're going to get out of the past. We're not where we were. Things are different. But like you said, Richard, the practitioners, the secretaries of defense, the secretaries of state, etc., they're going to keep things going. Is that? I mean, is the Republican, dilemma between these different factions that's just the same as the entire country?
Well, I think after long wars, Americans tend to become realists or retrenchers even. I mean, you can see this through our history. World War I, World War II was a little bit of an anomaly, but after Korea and then again after Vietnam and after these long wars, we sort of wake up and say, why the hell did we do that in the first place? We got to close the door to this. We're involved in these things because we're afraid that if we're not involved, then even worse things will happen than what happens when we are. But maybe that's wrong. let's, focus on priorities here at home. The problem tends to be that absolutist positions in one direction or the other don't tend to work very well. So, either genuinely forever wars where you just keep fighting and fighting and fighting forever with large commitments of resources don't work well and are not very politically and economically sustainable. But then we see what happens when we just abandon a situation and say, well, we'll leave it to the locals to sort out, or this is no longer our business, or we've been there too long. The withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, or even, areas of Afghanistan where we've already withdrawn from and things like that, the withdrawal from parts of northeastern Syria and things. And so what you see now is a lot of political resonance for the idea that, we've been fighting and present in places like Iraq and Afghanistan for a very, very long time without much to show for it, huge commitment of lives and treasure. And all of that is true. But it's also not a reason to just get out, because the point is not just what we have spent, what we have or have not accomplished, but rather the perceived risks of getting out versus staying and the cost thereof. And that's when it gets tricky, because there's a lot of political resonance to say, well, we've been in Afghanistan for 19 years. If that's not enough, why is a few extra years going to make all the difference and things like that? I think, however, there's actually a lot more leeway among the policymakers, including the president, than sometimes is popularly understood. The last time I checked, there were no protests in the streets about Iraq and Afghanistan. Most voters do not appear to have voted for either Donald Trump or Joe Biden based on their position on withdrawal or non-withdrawal from any of the so-called forever wars. And so, they're freer to make a policy decision based on what they perceive to be right or wrong, I think, more than the sort of political resonance. I think it's actually the same thing is true of alliances. When Donald Trump gets up in front of a rally and says, our allies are screwing us, they're getting rich under our protection, I'm going to make them pay their 2% or, whatever. Yeah, the people cheer, there's resonance, but who votes on that? I don't think probably anybody. And so that's why it's so easy.
So since Richard's frozen, can I jump in for a second to say two things?
Always the opportunist. Go.
First, that was a brilliant answer, and I wholeheartedly support it. But second, like Richard, I sailed on the pirate ship McCain, and I can hear John in the background vociferously objecting to the term endless wars. And conceding that as vocabulary is a mistake, because an alternative way to express that is to say, we have a conditions-based strategy that we are in Afghanistan until the Afghan government is strong enough to manage the threats we're actually worried about. And Endless Wars concedes that there are threats we're worried about, and that walking away from helping the Afghan government get capable enough to handle them is that there's a better alternative than that. So on John McCain's behalf, I object to the term endless wars.
Oh, I'm glad you brought up John McCain before I did, because we're definitely going to go there. But, the problem is, though, Corey, endless wars did resonate, just like Richard said, and whereas other things didn't. And to your earlier point of, Hamiltonians maybe didn't make the case enough. I've long, I think you and I have talked about this before, where if Trump winning is a problem and Trump directed foreign policy the problem, then was the problem behind it that the messaging wasn't good enough from the practitioners, or was it actually that there were problems with the policy and the people are right to question them? So the people are right to question forever wars. They don't need to be explained, why we need forward deployed troops in Afghanistan near Jalalabad because we got to do more counterterrorism ops a little bit, or any other reason. Like you said, that the Chicago Council shows people want, they want forward deployed troops. They want security.
So I think the answer is it's both of those things, Kevin, right? That I subscribe to the view that we haven't had an Afghan war for 20 years. We've had 20 Afghan wars. And part of the reason it's problematic is because we, as the political leadership, made a set of judgments about very expansive objectives we wanted to achieve, and then didn't resource those objectives adequately, either with military force or with economic and political engagement. So the mismatch between the resources and the objectives has always been a big problem in our Afghan strategy. But it's also the case, and of course we should bring them into alignment. But the other thing is that it also matters that the political leadership of President Trump and of President Obama, and also of Secretary Mattis, parenthetically, this is a reason not to have a recently retired military officer as Secretary of Defense, none of them were out talking to my mom about the wars we're fighting and why it matters that young people are being put in harm's way. If you don't have the political leadership making the case for what we're doing and why we're doing it, it does create a vacuum in which alternative explanations like endless wars get traction.
Well, leadership is one of my other questions for you, and I think we have Richard back with us in an alternate format. Are you there, Richard? Can you check in? I'm not hearing him. I'm hearing him. So.
Oh, there I am. Can you hear me now? The electricity has gone out here in Northern Virginia, so I want to fully endorse Corey's call for Infrastructure Week that she made earlier, because anyway.
Typical for the Mid-Atlantic. It's not even snowing yet, and we've already shut down the power.
Yeah, exactly. There's not been one flake, but Washington D.C. is preemptively turning off the electricity and plowing the streets and closing the schools. But I am back by phone, so anyway.
Excellent. Well, thank you for rejoining us. So speaking of leadership,
yeah,
leadership is an important topic I've been focusing on this year, especially the idea of who is going to, just like you said, Corey, who is going to make the case to the Americans? Because if it doesn't come from the White House, if it doesn't come from the President of the United States, who's it going to come from? But the question is leadership of what? And you mentioned John McCain. I think right after Richard, you lost power. Corey said she also sailed on the ship USS John McCain, whatever she said. The ship,
yeah.
the good ship John McCain. And one of our guests this week is going to be Senator Jeanne Shaheen, and I chose her because she is one of, I think, it's right to say, she is one of these senators who has picked up the baton as a vocal leader of American foreign policy, of internationalism at the big conferences where we love and see each other all the time, like at Munich and like at Halifax and Brussels and all these places. And the importance of having somebody of a caliber, of seniority, who's bringing up not just other members of Congress, but in theory, the people that those members support and reach. And so keeping it in the realm of the topic of the day, what now for conservatism foreign policy? People are asking all the time still, who is the next John McCain, or will there be the next John McCain? But talk about even just the importance of someone like that, and frankly, who's going to win the conversation? Because there are lots of members of Congress now. We have full-on QAnon conspiracy theorists who got elected on the Republican side, right alongside the actual sane humans I think it's safe to say, in the party and in Congress, who want just what John McCain wanted, who want just what, frankly, a lot of what Joe Biden wanted, and it's odd to put them together in a lot of their foreign policy views, but it's just as far the most basic of things, an active U.S. foreign policy, U.S. security policy that represents a leadership role, exceptionalism, as you said, Richard. And Corey, who do you eyeball for that kind of leadership right
now? Young Mike Gallagher, congressman from Wisconsin.
Also joining us this week.
Very good. I think there are quite a number. John Thune has a lot. Senator John Thune has a lot that's interesting to say. I think the heads of the Armed Services Committee on both sides of the line have been very strong advocates of that kind of foreign policy. Liz Cheney, Congresswoman Liz Cheney, was fantastic, leading a bipartisan effort in the House to deny the president the ability to withdraw troops from South Korea and from Europe. So I think there's actually a lot of internationalism and a lot of support for the kind of mainstream conservative internationalism that Richard described so beautifully at the start of this conversation.
Yeah, Richard, same to you. Who are the leaders that you see out there, and are the right ones winning in your mind? Right voices?
Well, there's the individuals that Corey just mentioned, and then the Congress. There are folks like Marco Rubio and Senator Joni Ernst and Dan Sullivan and Josh Hawley and Tom Cotton, who I think are offering ideas that are maybe a kind of a middle point between some of the more populist or Trump kind of impulses and the more traditional kind of establishment ones. The thing, however, is people often ask me who's the next John McCain, and the answer is there's not a next John McCain, or at least right now and for the time being. So, and the difference is not just a kind of intellectual leader on national security issues, but rather somebody who can bring a lot of senators with him or her toward positions. So, you will see here and there. I mean, Corey mentioned Congresswoman Cheney's efforts in the House on the non-withdrawal measure and things like that. So you can see examples here or there. But one of the things that Senator McCain often took to things is he would have quite a number of folks who looked to him for essentially policy leadership or political leadership on a set of issues, and then would go along with it. And he wasn't the only one. I mean, Carl Levin was a similar way on the Democratic side. Joe Biden was that way when he was in the Senate, and there are others as well. And you see now, I think, just more kind of solo operators instead of Senator Romney articulating a position, and then you can bet pretty well that's going to bring 20 Republicans with him, or 20 whoever, or Senator Rubio, or any of these other folks who speak out on these issues. It tends to be more of a fragmented kind of approach to things, and that have fewer people that sort of go along with a particular policy position. And of course, in bodies where where numbers matter, that diffuses the influence that they can have.
I want to ask both of you also something Rich and we talked about in our pre-chat, which is, I think we did. I may have just wrote this down myself, but the idea of the aesthetic of being a conservative in the national security world, right? And we've written a little bit about this in recent weeks, but especially as the protests in the summer have moved on, the visual of the extreme, Proud Boy militia type, decked out, kitted out, flying the Blue Lives Matter flag, has somehow become like a face for what it means to be tough on fill in the blank. I don't know, whatever it is. It's an extreme view, but it's a popular view right now. It's popular, and it's kind of one that's come out of some of the better storytelling of the war years we just came out of, right? The heroism of the special operators and the celebrating of those guys, guys has been picked up and now morphed into this, political meme of sense. How much does that, is that something that Republicans who are trying to have serious internationalist, measured foreign policy topics, not non-conspiratorial, how much is that something that you have to battle with to get to what you're saying, Corey, to get to your mom, my mom, to get to the American public to say, wait a minute, that's not what we represent or where we're going, and not just the view of it, but what they're proclaiming to portray, the extreme America first policy that they're representing.
So my sense is that one of the casualties of the Trump era is Republicans having a reputation for sound, sensible national security policy. And I agree with your judgment, Kevin, that that the president's policy choices and the fact that the imagery and the people you described are overwhelmingly Republican. Those are both big problems. for mild, moderate, middle of the road Republicans like myself. But it's also true that there are important counters to that. You know, when you were describing the visual, my initial thought was, but it's veterans and the defense establishment that are the counter to that, right? Efforts by young, talented veterans like Pete Lucier to change that, to confront those tendencies. But it's also not just, and we shouldn't let it be, the veterans community or the military who, you know, I love that Secretary Esper had been advocating in the NDAA that federal police forces need to wear demarcation so people don't mistakenly believe they're military.
Right.
Because for the American public to believe that would be injurious to the relationship between the military and our broader society. So we don't just want the military and veterans to be doing it. The moms in Portland in their yellow t-shirts confronting those kinds of dangers. That too is really important. And we Republicans need to show up for that too.
Richard, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, both on the right and the left, there's always been the kind of fringe groups, right? So, I mean, you know, the John Birchers go way back on the right, and some of these other folks on the left, you know, the kind of Noam Chomsky wing of the left has been around for a very long time, and
yeah, anti-globalizationists, you know, protesters of the last decade.
The difference is whether the leaders of the party and our elected leaders embrace them or ignore them or repudiate them, right? So it's one thing for folks to go out and say, you know, on the left to say, you know, abolish ICE, defund the police and things like that. It's different if, you know, Joe Biden were to say that's his program. It's one thing for, you know, folks to go in the streets and say, you know, this was a stolen election and it's going to be illegitimate, we won't accept it, and all these other things. It's different if the president of the United States embraces that view. And the reality is the president of the United States has embraced that view. And I think that's one reason why they're in the streets in the first place. And so, you know, the issue in my mind is less do these kinds of groups and movements exist, but what's their political salience? And their political salience is determined in large part by whether the leaders on each side actually embrace them and think that there's political benefit to be had by doing so. We haven't had Republican candidates for president or presidents who have done that, at least in a very long time. And we haven't had Democratic presidents who've done that on their side either. But we, the last 4 years, had an American president who had. That makes a huge difference. If we get back to you know, a set of political leaders, then I think that will lead to the increasing marginalization of what are already marginal groups.
Gotcha. You're a little choppy, but I heard you. I think drive it forward to some other the issues on the table now coming into the Biden administration. One of them, for example, is China. And in the last year, you know, in the public debate, China was reduced to a meme war, frankly, in my view. There was a whole lot of, it was Beijing Biden as a hashtag, and Donald Trump Jr. and you know, the Trump camp pushing out, you know, and the Hunter Biden connection, anything they can. But the counterpoint was Biden and his team saying, no, we're tough on China too. So we've got op-eds of people saying, actually, Biden's wrong to try to say he's tough on China. You're falling into the trap. And you even have now a piece. Tom Wright has a piece on that we ran, trying to parse the different, you know, future of Republican, you know, foreign policy, and Elbridge Colby and their new group are saying that they actually think, well, we're hard on China now, but we don't, you know, no one wants to go to war with China. We just want to get to a better point of détente. You know, the point is, they, like you said, Richard, on political saliency, these are theories and these are views that might be extreme, but they're the loudest ones right now in a lot of cases. You know, there's not a measured and reasoned debate about China going on in the mainstream press, especially not on cable TV, it's Beijing Biden versus weak on China, and it's Hunter Biden, and it's, so will there be any room for the new administration? Will Republicans of any stripe give leeway or give room or give, credit or help Biden, and their team get to a place or that's more measured, that's not on the fringe crazy that we've heard the last 4 years in some of these issues? Should they? Or is it, what, politics is fair game, and they're going to go after Biden no matter what he says?
I think there's going to be a mixture, but China is the one area I see it a little bit differently than the way you framed it, and maybe that's because I don't really watch much cable TV, or really any. But and because if you're looking for measured debate on any topic, China included, that's probably not the first place you would necessarily go. But I actually think there's a really interesting, very rich conversation going on at the policy and to some degree at the political level about what it actually means to compete with China, in what domains the United States should compete with China, with what allies, or how unilaterally to compete with China, what that means in terms of our own domestic policy and how strong and innovative and economically vibrant the United States needs to be to compete with China. And in fact, a whole strand of interesting policy questions, a lot of which have been kind of ignored for a long time, have been sort of, pushed off along with Infrastructure Week, are getting bound up in this question of what do we need to do when we are competing with a major superpower. And not only do I think that that's an interesting discussion that's being happened at the policy level, and new ideas are coming forward, but that is the one area where, yes, you will see political attacks and distinctions and accusations of being soft on China and all these other kinds of things, because China's back in as a political matter, probably for the first time really since about 1992, when Bill Clinton ran against George H.W. Bush and said he coddled butchers of Beijing and he wouldn't do that, and things like that. And then it's subsided in favor of all the other foreign policy issues that have been at the forefront. But not only will this be an area of political competition and all these other things, it's also a huge area of potential bipartisan cooperation. And as recently as yesterday, when President-elect Biden said that he was receiving calls from senior Republican senators, he said they were offering to work with me on China. And I think what you're going to see is both the kind of simplistic political stuff that you talked about, but also under this broad umbrella of China policy, which gets to domestic policy and economic policy and all these other kinds of things, this impulse to come together across party lines that you're frankly not going to see on almost anything else. I mean, you're just unlikely to see it on Iran and the JCPOA, or on on Saudi Arabia, or, even potentially on something like North Korea. So I think it's a little bit more complicated in that sense.
Yeah, and Corey, I want your answer just to let viewers know we're within 10 minutes. If you want to submit a question, please submit a question. We'll happily put it to our panelists. But continue the thread, Corey, on not only is what Americans will do about China, but will Republicans help and give Biden team leeway on this particular issue, if not others? And the difference, frankly, of what you're saying of, it's one thing if we're having nice debates here and on my pages and on your think tanks, but the fact is, on those cable shows, on Tucker Carlson and on, Lawrence O'Donnell, we're not getting nuanced debate at all. we're getting, are you tough and are you not? And how can I do anything in my power to sandbag?
So I can't improve on Richard's answer. I think he's exactly right. I would just add that what's driven this bipartisan consensus of tough and tougher on China is the behavior of the Chinese government. And the fact that that's getting through to people who don't want to have a serious, nuanced, well-informed debate actually says a lot about Chinese behavior. People are nervous about China for lots of good reasons. And I think, as Richard said, we're rightly reconsidering a policy that had been in place for 25 years or so, that as China became more prosperous, it would become more politically liberal. And I think there's a general consensus that that's not what China has done. So the question is, why not? And what do we do about it? And I do think there's a really rich debate going on about that.
Engagement was supposed to open it all up. We've learned that for many years now. See, it's interesting to me just to hear the way you phrase it is, well, the policies of the last 25 years have got us to where we are. But, in the hotbed partisan space, it's Obama's policies that got us to this place. It's only the last 8 years. It's not the last 25 or something like that, and I think you're both, I'm glad you mentioned China is such a bipartisan thing now. I mean, a year ago at the Munich conference, Pelosi was there, and even Pelosi was saying, I agree with Pompeo and Esper, that you could see American Democrats and Republicans, and Pelosi's not really considered a national security leader, but she's the, speaker, she's the speaker, but she's, what I mean. She's at Munich saying, we all agree because they're all trying to convince Europeans and others and everybody in our space in the national security world is on a mission lately, it seems, to convince the rest of the world to wake up a little bit and say, hey, actually, China today is different than, and we need to do something about it. So what I'm curious, Corey, when you heard Pompeo this summer start saying, I think just this summer, start saying, this is a battle for our soul. That was his language. I mean, is that something you like to hear, or like I saw your eyes roll a little bit, like, well, that's one way to put it, but that's how you reach a larger audience.
So what I think is striking is that despite the incredibly clumsy, ham-handed way the Trump administration has handled the Huawei debate and 5G, that Europeans have actually consolidated around the American view, and that speaks to the merits of the case, actually, because well, let me put it this way. I love Peggy Noonan's description that very few people actually like the smell of sulfur. And so incendiary policies tend not to get much traction in democracies. So I think it's striking that even as belligerent as Trump administration policy has been on 5G, Angela Merkel's German government has swung to that position. Boris Johnson's British government has swung to that position. Because the merits of the case are quite strong because of China's behavior.
Yeah, well, we're in the last couple of minutes. So with the quick remaining time, give us your quick look ahead or in response to what you've seen from the Biden nominees to come, whether it's Austin or Tony Blinken at State, or today I'm seeing potentially Samantha Power at USAID, which would be quite I think a personality boost for that agency that's been long the lesser of the 3 Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development. And for the topic of the future of conservatism and foreign policy, where you see the movement, if there is one going, and where would you like it to go? So a little bit on Biden's team, a little bit on yourselves. Corey, go.
So on the Biden team, a lot of talented professionals who will serve the country so much better than the Trump administration has served the country. And yet I would love to see them cast their net even more widely. So for example, not appoint someone whose sole experience is in the American military as the Secretary of Defense. And the reasons that President-elect Biden listed for nominating Lloyd Austin, that we need the logistics experience of the American military for vaccine distribution. It would come as a surprise, for example, to the head of the post office or to Jeff Bezos that the American military is uniquely qualified in logistics. We need to cast our net even wider because it really matters to bring diversity of experience, not just diversity of personal narrative, into these positions, to connect the whole of American society, not just those who have already had government experience.
Richard?
Yeah, I think so far I've been generally really pleased and with who's been appointed to most of the main positions. I mean, in folks like Tony Blinken and Avril Haines and Jake Sullivan, I think you've got people who are coming from a moderate, very constructive and pragmatic position within the party. They know their brief, and they are likely to work together quite well as a team. I agree with Corey that the SecDef nomination so far is an outlier here. I hope that works out well, but it's a little bit harder to foresee at this point. On the question about the future of conservatism. I guess the one point I would make is that most of the answer to that question is going to be politically driven, not intellectually driven. So, I've been part of, these various groups of Republicans who over the past, 4 or 5 years sort of get together for, where are we going to take the party on, are we going to be able to move it in a more internationalist direction? For a while, it was kind of the Rand Paul kind of restraint or maybe even neo-isolationist kind of worry, and then it of course was Donald Trump and things like that, and those are always interesting, and I will continue to participate in those. But to some degree, it sometimes feels a little bit like a meeting of the White Russians in Helsinki in 1920, planning for the next day when the Bolsheviks are gone, because certainly they can't last forever. And of course, in 1991. Bolsheviks went away, but all the White Russians were dead, and so we don't know where this is going to go. But this is ultimately going to be determined by politics. I mean, had one of the other Republican candidates in 2016 been the nominee, we would be having a totally different conversation about what it means to be a conservative or a Republican in national security affairs. We're having the conversation we're having because Donald Trump won. And so, ultimately, this is going to flow from what the voters want in their nominee and who's kind of getting traction and at the political level. So the world of ideas is going to be an important adjutant to that, but it's not going to be determinative. It's going to be ultimately determinative by what the people want. And here it's an open question because, as Trump has demonstrated, there is a major kind of vein of votes to be had for those with a more populist message, as opposed to those with a more sort of, country club Republican message about, particularly on the domestic policy and economic policy side, and whether non-Donald Trump people can go after that group of voters successfully, and what the messages are going to be to do that is a huge question mark, and that will in part determine the direction of the foreign policy approach of the party.
Yeah, thank you. Well, you had Corey in stitches with Helsinki, so congratulations on that. And I'm sure in your next series of deep state meetings with your friends, we'll come up with some future. I thank you both for joining us and for your insights on this. Look, it's fascinating. A lot of these conversations, the three of us, we've had with each other, we've had with our friends and our colleagues for more than 4 years, including, I think, again, to that whole notion of what leaders say versus the policies that they put out, what resonates with the people, like you're saying, Richard. We'll find out in future elections and who can lead the parties, and whether you're leading the party for other issues that national security just gets to come along for the ride for, and in more than actually drives. That may be more important than anything, but we will see, as we always say. We will see very, very shortly. So I won't keep you any longer. I thank you very much for your time. A couple, closing remarks and instructions. I want to first let everyone know, stick around for a quick word from our exclusive underwriter, Cisco, and be sure to tune back in at 11 a.m. tomorrow when we will host the next interview series, which is our conversation with Senator Jeanne Shaheen, hosted by NBC's Corey Kuby from the Pentagon. And later in the week, we also are going to have Senator Angus King with Representative Mike Gallagher, one of the rising stars Corey identified earlier as well, talking about some tech and in other policy, digital policy as well. So thank you again to our modern conservatives of the hour for everything that they said. It was great to see them, and hope you'll join us next time. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Daniela Fair, publisher at Defense One, and I'm excited to continue today's conversation with Sean Robertson. Sean is Senior Operations Director of DoD at Cisco. Thanks for joining me today, Sean.
Thanks, Danielle. It's a pleasure to speak with you again.
Sean, I'm hoping you can just take a moment before we get into our discussion, just to tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your background, and how you arrived at the current role you have at Cisco.
Absolutely. So I have responsibility for the Cisco's Department of Defense business. I've been in this role for about a year. Prior to this role, I ran Cisco's architecture business for federal. That's where we developed our first hosted cloud collaboration solution for government. And prior to Cisco, I spent time at Oracle and CA. So my background prior to Cisco is primarily in the application space.
Great. I think that really helps our audience understand your point of view. The DoD is facing multiple challenges, to include various multi-vendor approaches to the DoD enterprise environment. Some of the issues, as outlined by various senior leaders across DoD, is bridging the tactical edge to the enterprise environment, supporting episodic demands, building resilient infrastructure to scale technology, and addressing data silos. So Sean, I'm hoping you can help start by just telling us what are some of your thoughts on how Cisco can help DoD address these particular challenges.
Yes, so the goal is to enable mission success without the worries of technology. Technology should enable the mission and not be a hindrance. The recently published DoD data strategy vision statement highlights that the DoD is a data-centric organization. It uses data at speed and scale for operational advantage and increased efficiency. Additionally, it recognizes that data is a strategic asset and therefore it must be operationalized. Having said that, it's critical to take a platform approach when talking about edge to cloud, and you must build a foundation when you're going to operationalize data. Cisco's approach is to help the DoD build a foundational platform for their operations. We recognize that to do that, to provide all of the necessary, we do not provide all the necessary pieces and parts and solutions or parts that go into the solution. We know that the DoD is going to operate in a multi-vendor environment. And these are similar challenges that we see facing all of our customers, not just the DoD. It's why Cisco's made it a priority to really develop solutions with open APIs to support third-party integrations. It's also why Cisco's made an investment to establish a Devnet community.
So let me ask you this, Sean. Can you share with our audience like a particular example or examples of Cisco enabling multi-vendor interoperability?
Yeah, so there's two good examples. So the first is our Cisco HCSD, and that's a hosted cloud collaboration solution, and it's Impact Level 5. And it's the only Impact Level 5 collaboration solution available to the DoD today. It is an open standard cloud option, and it allows for seamless integration into Microsoft. So it allows them to deliver demand collaboration capabilities to service members. Because it's a cloud offering, it offers flexibility, simplicity, and most important, affordability. It allows for faster deployment of new services, as most cloud solutions do. The second example is really around security and zero trust. We all hear the importance and the DoD's focused on a zero trust architecture. Cisco's zero trust architecture secures connections of applications, microservices, or containers, regardless if they reside in a data center or a cloud, or in the soon-to-be Microsoft Jedi cloud. And knowing that the security architectures were always going to be multi-vendor, Cisco developed an exchange grid called PX Grid. And so what PX Grid allows the DoD to do is to really integrate multiple security products, and then allows them to have the ability to share data and work together. This will be a key to the DoD as they move forward with the zero trust architecture.
So you mentioned.
Oh, I was going to add on to that. We recognize that all of our solutions are going to reside in multi-vendor environments, as we just mentioned with security. We've made a significant investment in the Devnet platform, which environment and community, what I mentioned earlier. And this allows third-party unique government solutions to be easily integrated into the Cisco platforms. And the commitment to the... go ahead. I'm sorry, Dana.
No, that's quite all right. Go ahead.
So our commitment to Devnet can be shown by that we've introduced certifications for our Devnet environments into our Cisco networking academies, and the services use our Cisco networking academies as part of their formal training process.
Got it. That's what I was going to ask about on Devnet on that front. Does Devnet provide an interoperability platform other than security? Because you're using that as an example.
Absolutely. It supports numerous platforms, including networking, IoT, mobility, data center, and collaboration, which I mentioned earlier.
Great. So, Sean, give me an example of a DoD customer leveraging these capabilities. I'm sure our audience wants to hear about those pilots out there or programs that are operating right now.
So absolutely. So the first one that comes to mind is the virtual pilot ship within the Navy. And that's, they're looking at the weapon systems on the Aegis class submarine. And they use the Cisco platform, which is essentially a cloud deployed on the ship. And it's an open standard software-based platform that allows integration with all solutions. It allows to give them capabilities to the sailors seamlessly and to build ad hoc services. And so it's currently been deployed on an Aegis class ship and is out for testing as we speak.
There's been a lot of buzz about 5G lately. I know at Defense One, we're certainly covering it a lot and plan to be discussing it into 2021. How does Cisco play in 5G for the Department of Defense? That's
a great question. So obviously, it's been top of mind in the DoD, and it's also very much top of mind for Cisco. Often when folks think about 5G, they think about the RF component of it or the radio frequency component. And what 5G does is it really increases the ability to deliver capabilities out at the edge, but it also allows for additional capacity. So adding a lot more connected devices. Think Internet of Things, right? It's a big place there. With the increase in capacity and the increase in the number of connected devices, the question becomes, will their infrastructure be able to support or provide security and agility to support these additional connections? And what Cisco brings together is our software-defined capability in the networking, along with private 5G, to provide the robust platform that will improve the productivity and efficiency in the critical operations. We're currently engaged in supporting initiatives in 5G in areas around manufacturing today. In some of the other areas where it's going to be it's going to help provide solutions to be around warehousing, shipyards, and depots.
Sean, to bring us full circle, and I know you mentioned IBN or intent-based networking. How does IBN enable DoD interoperability?
Yeah, so an architectural approach driven by intent-based networking, and we talked a little bit earlier about operationalizing data, is really around the mission thread from the edge to the cloud. And this integrated approach will enable the DoD to better manage and control the resiliency, security, and performance when you start talking about delivering services to the edge all the way from the cloud. It helps assure the delivery of highly reliable, available services the DoD requires for successful missions.
Well, Sean, I think you and I could probably spend hours talking about this. There's just so much to cover, but I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with me today and share your insights with our audience. I think it's been a very valuable conversation. I certainly learned something. And I want to thank Cisco for supporting this year's Defense One's Outlook 2020 as our elite underwriter. Today's program certainly would not be possible without their partnership. Many thanks to our audience for being with us today. We encourage you to tune in to our other Defense One Outlook sessions and share them with your colleagues who might be interested. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Daniela.